with 6 or 7 years' experience, so it is certainly in keeping with his government's mandate. Given that, once again, we are in a situation where the wage decision is out of government's control. And this Premier knows full well the wage increase built into the business plan will not suffice, even if the arbitrator rules for the wage increase on the lowest end of the scale. Will the Premier clarify once and for all, will the government be approving a business plan that will have even more job cuts and loss of services than previously anticipated, or will his government cover the bill for capital health? Which is it, Mr. Premier?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll say again that we will support the business plans that have come forward from the District Health Authority, but the simple reality is that the District Health Authorities and the Department of Health have a partnership where they seek to resolve issues both with respect to service delivery and with respect to the resources that are committed to that service delivery. I think this is what the people of Nova Scotia expect. They expect that we will respect their need for service, but they also expect that we will respect the fact that every cent that we spend in healthcare comes right out of their pockets.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in response to the NDP and their decision to tear up the municipal MOU last year, towns and municipalities are being forced in a position of raising taxes. We know that Queen's municipalities institute a 3% hike because of the NDP. Queens is not alone. The municipality of Digby will incur $136,525 more in expenditures this year because of the decision of the NDP to tear up the MOU. This added pressure on the municipalities already struggling to keep up with the added costs such as raising power costs, wastewater treatment, and supports to organizations. My question is to Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. Why is the minister intent on balancing the province books on the backs of the municipalities and on property tax owners?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're doing no such thing. Actually, I spoke with members from the UNSM today, and I think some members of the House as well. The situation actually has been that I think many municipal units have not raised the rate for their taxpayers. There is no indication that any changes to the MOU have caused increase in rates for taxpayers. And as far as Queens go, I think there's some infrastructure, new infrastructure they're building there. That would that's their choice to increase the rate to help cover those costs. But we are considering all Nova Scotians and all taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, there's only one taxpayer for all three levels of government, and so this government actually has considered their concerns. They have about 140 million surplus among the municipal units, and I think that they are not being penalized by this government.
The honourable member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, a 3% increase in Queens, an additional 3 cents on the residential tax rate in Digby, and the County of Colchester they are facing with shortfalls due entirely to the minister's decision to tear up the municipal MOU. This coming year, the County of Colchester is facing a $529,907 shortfall. This means an additional 2.59 cents on both the residential and commercial tax rates. Faced with increasing service requirements, increased power costs, municipalities are struggling with the NDP's minister breach of faith on the MOU, and residents are paying more property taxes. My question to the minister is, will the minister admit his decision to tear up the MOU is resulting in higher taxes for residents?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very difficult for me to admit something that's not true. The issue of the MOU, as the member opposite describes it, is my tearing it up. If he was to examine it, he would actually see there is a clause in the MOU that allows the government to move away if they cannot afford it. That was not signed by this government. It was signed by a former member of the Conservative government with the UNSM. They can't avoid what was actually written in the agreement, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 3% in Queens, an additional 3 cents on the residential tax rate in Digby, an additional 2.59 cents in both residential commercial tax rate in the county of Colchester. This is what the minister's decision means, and it adds up. The municipality of Argyll is faced with difficult decisions around service delivery. Nova Scotians across the province are faced with paying more for less thanks to this NDP government. My question is, will the minister reconsider his decision to tear up the MOU?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The state of the MOU is the state of the MOU going forward. Municipal units actually have gotten a break on their corrections costs. The province absorbed $4 million in costs that the municipal units would have been responsible for, so they are getting a break with the change in the MOU. I speak to the wardens and mayors quite often. Matter of fact, I saw the warden for Colchester County just recently. He didn't raise any issue around the MOU causing them to raise taxes. So I would say that the member opposite is right in one thing, that the things I say do add up, which is contrary to the things he says. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, early diagnosis of cystic fibrosis greatly impacts the quality of life of affected individuals. Screening newborns for cystic fibrosis would have an incredible impact on both the day-to-day lives of patients and the costs associated with their care. Studies reveal there's a significant difference between those who are screened at birth and those who are diagnosed in a clinical setting. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. When will Nova Scotia follow the example set by other provinces and include cystic fibrosis among the disorders screened for in our newborn screening service?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for a very important question. Mr. Speaker, I believe that there are really only a few provinces that are currently doing this particular test. Mr. Speaker, we are looking at what is happening elsewhere. We have a very good screening program in Nova Scotia where we do, in fact, screen newborns for, I think the staff in the department told me, more than 30-some different disorders, and we will continue to gather the scientific information with respect to this particular procedure and what the cost and the impact might be. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, cystic fibrosis patients are used to frequent hospital stays, on top of dealing with both intravenous antibiotics and a host of other drugs. Each year we spend over $1 million on these drugs alone. A report from the Health Department indicates that an average of $7,443 is spent on each patient every year. In examining the total cost of care for an individual with CF, inpatient hospitalization is not factored in, though it represents up to 47% of the cost. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister. Can the Minister explain why her government would rather cut frontline services in areas like health and education instead of being proactive like some of our fellow provincial governments?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, there have been no cuts to frontline services in the Department of Health in this province. And Mr. Speaker, if members of the third party want to sit down and examine the Health Department's budget. The Health Department's budget continues to grow and has grown by millions of dollars in each of the 3 years we've brought budgets forward. In fact, in this year, the Health Department's budget is growing by 2.5%, Mr. Speaker. So we continue to invest in health care. We invest strategically in the area of health care. We have priorities. We are investing in better care sooner for people, collaborative care practices, and keeping emergency rooms open around the province, reducing wait times, Mr. Speaker, and soon in a mental health strategy. So these are our government's priorities, and we will continue to focus on them, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria de Lakes on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important that the government consider newborn screening for CF as a priority as well, but they're not doing that. Mr. Speaker, cost savings aside, the department should adapt testing solely based on the fact that cystic fibrosis patients are reported as having a better quality of life. An American study indicated that children diagnosed after undergoing newborn screening have benefited from better lung function and body mass index. In Ontario, Mr. Speaker, the screening program was implemented to avoid frequent infection and long-term damage to the lungs. So my final question to the minister is, can the minister explain to this House why an opportunity to save money and lives is not attractive to her government?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, with respect to screening and the cystic fibrosis issue, it's something that we will certainly examine and are examining. But, Mr. Speaker, the decisions that will be made with respect to investing in this will be based on the scientific information. And the screening, as I understand in Ontario, is relatively new, and we will take a look at what the impact is in Ontario and whether or not it in fact contributes to better outcomes for CF patients and has a positive financial impact on the system.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, with upcoming changes to old age security in the most recent Harper Conservative budget, Nova Scotians are concerned that they are going to be left behind. Old age security is especially important to low-income households, and these changes will have a disproportionate impact on those with little or no savings, those unable to replace OAS with some other type of employment income, and those with very physically demanding jobs. This will also have a direct impact on the cost for services provided to these people by the provincial government. My question for the Minister of Finance is, has the minister estimated the effect of these changes on the future spending requirements of the province?
Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for a very good question. She asked the same question in estimates, and for the benefit of the House, I'll give the same answer. This is an extremely important issue. The change of the qualifying age of old age security from 65 to 67 has enormous implications throughout government. To name only a few, the ones the member mentioned: community services, workers' compensation, all public and private pension plans, because so much is geared towards the age 65. With all members of the House, we need to work our way towards this, but it is quite a large, significant undertaking to figure out exactly what the implications are, and we are working on that, and we'll continue to work on that. And when we have those results, which I don't expect to be for some time, we'll certainly share that with the House, because it affects so very many people in this province.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the minister said, there's going to be programs like workers' comp, community services, and many others that are going to cost the province of Nova Scotia more money if there's a 2-year gap that will have to be funded for. So my question to the minister is has he begun to calculate the impact of those changes so that we can take that message about how detrimental it is to Nova Scotia directly back to the federal government so that they know of our objections? So has he begun to calculate it?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a very significant policy undertaking. By way of comparison, I would just remind the member that over the entire time that I've been the Minister of Finance, the federal, provincial, territorial finance ministers have been working on a retirement income adequacy project, which took an enormous amount of effort on the part of all governments. A great deal of staff time was devoted to it, and regrettably, mainly because of the federal government, the issue is no longer really on the table, and I think that's very regrettable. But one thing that I did learn from that whole project was just how complex the issue of retirement income adequacy is, and this adds another dimension to an already very complicated area. We are working on it. We will continue to work on it, but it certainly is not something that we would get the full picture on just between the time of the announcement in the federal budget and now.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that concerns me particularly about the coming change, and I recognize it's some years off, but I think that we cannot be too quick in starting to signal our concern about it. But one of the big concerns is the current government's, and really I think the province's interest in the trades and trade training. And we know that if we're going to have the jobs that are coming with the shipbuilding project, a lot of those are going to be heavy, hard construction jobs that take their toll on workers. It's harder for them to work up to 65, let alone an additional 2 years. So the impact will be felt greatly, I think, in the trades area. So with all of this in mind, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance if he has done anything yet as part of the federal, provincial, territorial group, or as the Minister of Finance for Nova Scotia, has he signaled in any way to the federal government that these changes are going to be very detrimental, you know, and that we are really strongly objecting to them?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The next meeting of the federal, provincial, territorial finance ministers is in June, or at least we expect it in June, because the date is essentially set by the federal government, and they did cancel one meeting without consulting with the provinces. But we do expect the next one will be in June, and I do expect that this topic will be on the agenda. But like the whole retirement income adequacy project, it is not the sort of thing that gets dealt with or resolved at a single meeting. It's going to take a great deal of staff time in every jurisdiction to figure out all the implications and consequences. But I do thank the member for raising the issue today. It is a very, very important issue for many Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Public Service Commission. Mr. Speaker, we all know the value of leading by example. And Mr. Speaker, there would be no greater example than one which highlights a public service that is truly inclusive of all people and accurately reflects the population it serves. We all know Nova Scotia has the highest rate of disabilities in Canada, a rate which currently stands at 20%. So my first question to the Minister is, what percentage of the public service is made up of persons who have identified themselves with a disability?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a very good question, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the answer right at my fingertips, but I will endeavour to get that for the member as soon as I possibly can. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Clare on his first supplementary.
And I thank the Minister for his commitment. Mr. Speaker, there's no question government programs are needed to support programs with disabilities. More important, however, Mr. Speaker, are the huge benefits that can be achieved when a person with a disability is able to demonstrate that if given the opportunity, they are willing, able, and very capable members of any workforce, and that includes the public service. While I can appreciate that this information may not be readily available, I'm wondering if the Minister could advise the House of the number of applicants and interviews granted for individuals who identified themselves with disability in 2011-2012 fiscal year.
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, and thank the member again for the question, Mr. Speaker. That's a very wide-ranging question. I think the member realizes that. Again, I would not have that right at my fingertips, member, but through you, Mr. Speaker, I will endeavour to get those answers. I would expect it would be somewhat difficult, the ones that actually get to the interview process, but we'll do our best to get as accurate a number as we can for you as quickly as we can.
The Honourable Member for Clare on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I thank the Minister for looking into this and providing us with the information at his earliest convenience. Mr. Speaker, the success of ensuring a truly diverse workforce is ensuring that applications and interviews result in hiring. So my final question to the Minister is, of the number of applicants and interviews granted for persons who have self-identified as having a disability, how many were hired in the last year?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I get so few questions on it, and yet I got so few answers, and I apologize to the member for that, Mr. Speaker. But what I do agree with, Mr. Speaker, and I think every member of this House agrees with the ability of diversity and with people with disabilities, that the government show leadership and be a leader in all of this, Mr. Speaker, and we will do that, and I will give my word through you, Mr. Speaker, to that member. We will get this information to him as quickly as we can, and I thank him again for his question, because it's a very good question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tri-County Regional School Board is facing some difficult decisions. Because of the NDP government's $65 million in cuts to public education, the school board is looking at cutting 11 teachers from our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. The superintendent of the board has said, despite what this minister says, any reductions will have impacts on services and supports to schools. And I'll table those comments, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister think that cutting 11 teaching positions won't impact the classroom?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I trust that Tri-County made the decisions in the best interest of the students in the classroom. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
The decisions of this government has placed a $2.5 million shortfall in the budget for the Tri-County School Board, Mr. Speaker. As a result, they are forced to cut teaching positions, something that this minister said would not happen. This minister continues to fall back on the argument around declining enrollment. However, the real costs of educating our youth don't tie into enrollment numbers, Mr. Speaker. So will the minister admit to parents in the Tri-Counties that just because enrollment's going down doesn't mean the cost of our education is?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm a bit confused because as requested, school boards were to look at retirements and attrition, and it is my understanding that Tri-County was able to meet their budget obligation without laying or cutting anybody. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Tri-County School Board is facing a $2.5 million deficit in funding as a result of this government's decisions. They are eliminating 11 teaching positions from the Tri-Counties, and there's nobody in the right mind that will say that's not going to impact the classroom, Mr. Speaker. It's going to. Mr. Speaker, the students in Tri-County Regional School Board need the Minister of Education to be a leader of education and to advocate for them at the cabinet table. Instead, she puts hundreds of thousands of dollars into political advertising and over $500,000 into lunch bags with hacky sacks, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister stand in the House today and tell parents and students in the Tri-County Regional School Board that she will advocate for public education and call on her cabinet colleagues to restore funding to our schools so that we don't lose any teaching positions, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are making an investment in our students all across Nova Scotia, and we are dealing with a challenge, and that is declining enrollment. We are increasing our spending per student. I would like to say that I am making sure that school boards that are adversely affected by a steep declining enrollment have been protected. We did put a cap of 2.1 on Tri-County. Their enrollment decline for the coming year is 3.2. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP have driven rural Nova Scotia to its deathbed, and now they want to kill it. Unless, of course, it's in the Deputy Premier's constituency. Mr. Speaker, we now know that 36 Department of Justice jobs moved to New Waterford were not from Halifax at all. They were from parts of rural Nova Scotia and other economically disadvantaged regions. The reality is the NDP have not created one new single job in rural Nova Scotia. They've only shuffled a handful around. Simply put, the NDP's job creation plan for Nova Scotia can be compared to rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic. So my question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is, given that not a single new job has been created for rural Nova Scotians under this NDP government, and the job losses actually range in the thousands, will the Minister finally be honest and straightforward with rural Nova Scotians and admit that they are simply not a priority for this NDP government?
Order, please. That is unparliamentary and out of order to finally be honest. Yes, it is. The impunity of the minister. I'd ask the honourable member to please rephrase that question, please.
Will the minister finally be straightforward with Nova Scotians?
Thank you.
And admit they are simply not a priority for this NDP government?
Thank you. The honourable Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's certainly at every opportunity I get, I enjoy getting on my feet and having the opportunity to talk about the progress that this province is making in jobs and growing the economy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has made investments in every region of the province of Nova Scotia. We continue to make those investments. We want Nova Scotians to have the right skills for the good jobs that are being created in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is well positioned, not only for today, but well into the future, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, people in Amherst, New Glasgow and Kentville are all paying the price of the NDP's reckless economic mismanagement today. These communities have already suffered enough damage under the NDP's watch. Closed businesses, lost jobs, and an inattentive Minister of Economic Development. However, it appears the NDP are ready to pay lots of attention to the Deputy Premier's riding. My question is, why is the job in New Waterford more valuable to the NDP government than a job in New Glasgow, Kentville, or Amherst?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I hear a question like that, Mr. Speaker, I'm curious because you know, we've made investments, and I've mentioned already once in this House, Mr. Speaker, about the investment we made in Bill Did It, which is in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Poirier's boat building, Mr. Speaker, also in Cape Breton. TriStar business in Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on. Over 200 investments that we've made in businesses here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we've taken 20 years of being ignored and we've turned it around.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how many actual jobs were created in Cape Breton since this government has taken power? The numbers speak for themselves, Mr. Speaker. Rural Nova Scotia is down 8,000 jobs. And the NDP, in particular, this Minister of Economic Development, have done nothing, Mr. Speaker, absolutely nothing for rural Nova Scotia. We've seen businesses from one end of the province to the other close. We've seen vital links to nearby economies eliminated. And we've seen more and more young people forced out of rural communities they've called home in search of work. more people are leaving rural Nova Scotia to work out west, Mr. Speaker, than ever. Mr. Speaker, my question, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development admit that his disastrous policies and gross neglect have driven rural Nova Scotia into a recession?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, when I...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
We are putting jobs in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, not taking them out.
The time allotted for oral questions put by ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to table a document regarding some questions that the member from Clare asked me, and I said I would get back to him. These are in response to your first question, member, and I'll try and endeavour to get the rest for the two supplementaries.
Thank you. I will now recognize the Deputy House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd call private members' public bills for second reading.
Private members' bills for second reading.
Yes, thank you. I'll call Bill number 45, the Ratepayer Protection Act.
Bill 45, the Ratepayer Protection Act. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please to rise on this opposition day to speak to Bill 45, the Ratepayers Protection Act. And I first wanted to outline what this actual bill does encompass. And it is to conduct the bill will require Nova Scotia Power to conduct biannual performance and value for money audits, which will be made public, to publish estimated and actual costs on a regular basis, require public settlement meetings before any proposed general rate hike, and it will prevent millions in executive bonuses and regulatory costs being passed on to ratepayers. Mr. Speaker, this is, again, a bill and a mechanism whereby we can actually work to get stabilized power rates in our province. We pay some of the highest rates in Canada, and over the last 10 years, electricity rates have increased 7 times. It has become now almost an expectation that in Nova Scotia, over 400,000 households, businesses will actually get an annual power increase. And now Nova Scotia Power has sought another large increase on the backs of customers. We have, of course, a 20% increase in just 2 of those 7 years. And we have seen power rates increase, dig deeper into the pockets of Nova Scotians. But we heard a question here in the House today, Madam Speaker, in regards to those impacts of power rates. We have seen the Good Neighbour Energy Fund have requests at the highest level that we have seen since this program run by the Salvation Army has been in existence. Fortunately, both Nova Scotia Power and government, and in fact government came through on a second occasion this year. But it still tells us that, it is in fact in good measure those power rates, those power bills that come in monthly or bi-monthly that Nova Scotians are having a greater challenge with. Nova Scotians have faced down continued rate increases from Nova Scotia Power and added electricity taxes courtesy of the NDP and Conservative governments. And again today, we've had questions challenging demand-side management. We all know that conservation, improving our homes to become more efficient, also industry and business to make investments, However, again, it is Nova Scotians paying this. Many Nova Scotians, in fact, who are not in a position to actually benefit from Efficiency Nova Scotia. They don't have the ability to be able to make the kind of significant investments that, in fact, will improve the R factor in their homes, therefore improve the conservation of energy and ultimately reduce their power bill. So these have gone forward. As we know, Nova Scotians really haven't had an opportunity to have much say. They simply have shown up on the power bill. And we're finding out, I think, in our constituency offices more and more that, while demand-side management is a term that perhaps many don't quite understand, it really is, of course, Efficiency Nova Scotia, but they are asking, what is that new amount on my power bill? And why did it go up this year? And we know, of course, it's at 40 million. Take of Nova Scotia's tax dollars now, and it's going to go to 80 million. So we know that that rate is going to continue to escalate over a number of years. Really, there's simply no more revenue for Nova Scotia Power to take from people of this province. When we look at, 80% of Nova Scotians, make under or their home value is around 100,000, a bit over 100,000, many less, and to deal with the kind of demands that they have, it is becoming more challenging. In fact, increasing power rates mean increases in just about everything from food to property taxes. When our mainline stores get their bills, guess what? We pay their bills. We pay their bills. Let's make no mistake about it. So as that rate goes up by 10% more, or perhaps higher for commercial, then that's passed on to the food that we will go, whether it's the mainline stores or whether it's the corner store, we in fact are paying that price. So really what is happening in Nova Scotia, is really part of just a small number of jurisdictions that have very, very high power rates. And it's in fact, it's an attack on the standard of living of Nova Scotians. So this is why the Liberal caucus has introduced a Ratepayers Protection Act. It is just one step of many a Liberal government would take to ensure Nova Scotia Power is accountable to Nova Scotians. If passed, this bill will reduce power rates for Nova Scotians and will give homeowners and businesses direct access to what their rates pay for. In other words, by doing an audit, we would exactly know, with the biannual performance, and also require public settlement meetings before any proposed general rate hike, so that Nova Scotians are actually informed. Is there an investment in improving the transmission lines? Are there more workers required? Again, this bill would help Nova Scotians understand that. Nova Scotians and the province's business community are pushed to the brink with the high power rates and aren't able to withstand further increases. And one of the areas that we are hearing more and more is from the business community, those that have invested, want to invest further, and they now realize that our power rates are putting us in an uncompetitive place. Provinces like especially British Columbia and Quebec that produce almost all of their power from hydroelectricity have that kind of an advantage. We are, as a province, transitioning to more renewable energy, which is a positive. I remember back to those days. In fact, I think it was my first year teaching when, of course, we had the oil embargo, and we were using tremendous amounts of bunker C to produce electricity in Nova Scotia. Our rates started to take off. And at that time, which is getting close to 40 years ago, it was advised that we start a transition towards renewable energy. And in fact, we are very late in the game in developing renewable energy. We have made some strides in recent years, and I acknowledge the fact that it will in time pay advantages for us. But in the meantime, so the NDP government's only answer has been to trumpet the removal of the HST from electricity bills. However, this does not benefit actually small business. And we realize that even for all Nova Scotians, it's been more than offset by the NDP electricity tax. And it did not benefit mills like New Page and Bowater. And one of the reasons why both those mills, are in considerable trouble for certainly Bowater in the long-term outlook does not look very good. New Page and the deal that is emerging, and just today, in fact, I did have some detailed explanation of the Nova Scotia Power and the Stern company agreement that is emerging, and it does hold promise for the Stern mill and future operations in Port Hawkesbury. But it was power rates that were the ultimate cause of bringing these two mills to the brink of closure. And again, as I said, long term, Bowater is literally on life support due to, of course, the power bills that they pay. Now, we're actually, every Nova Scotian is also helping to pay the power bill at Bowater. That's how severe their costs are around electricity. In fact, the NDP, in cooperation with the Tories, did everything they could to hurt those businesses when it came to power rates. For the NDP to keep talking about the HST removal as a solution is an insult to everyone in this province that runs a business. While the HST removal had no benefit to those mills, the Tories, while in government, proposed a new electricity tax, which mills like New Page, along with other electricity consumers in the province, from businesses to low-income families, would be forced to pay. The NDP opposed that tax during the 2009 election, but promptly implemented it in their first session after becoming government with the support of the Tory caucus. They literally called it a Christmas gift to Nova Scotians. Instead of the Conservative and the NDP deciding that Nova Scotia Power shareholders should pay for efficiency costs, they decided low-income Nova Scotians and struggling businesses should pay those costs. These increases stretch budgets, put a strain on pocketbooks, and make doing business in Nova Scotia unaffordable. The last dozen years brought a series of Conservative and NDP governments that failed to stand up to Nova Scotia Power. But the Conservatives and the NDP had the opportunity to rein in power rates that increased by 38% over the last decade, and both failed to do so. So both the Conservative and the NDP had a chance to put an end to the Nova Scotia bonuses, but also failed to do so. I believe if there is one area that again, all Nova Scotians are coming to understand is that, we pay those bonuses. and they are pretty significant bonuses that are handed out at Nova Scotia Power. Conservative government sat back and watched this problem grow while taking no action except proposing new taxes, implementing energy legislation without outlining the costs. Now, the NDP want us to believe that they care about the pain Nova Scotians are in, and the Conservatives want you to believe they care by proposing legislation based on principles Liberals have been talking about for 2 years, such as ending tax ratepayer-funded bonuses and suggesting costs of renewable energy legislation should be outlined at the time of bill introduction, when they didn't even do that themselves. Our work begins with Nova Scotians knowing whether they're getting value for money, whether the parent company, Emera, is simply bleeding Nova Scotia Power dry. With Nova Scotians staring down the barrel of a 7th power rate hike in 10 years, Liberals have repeatedly asked the NDP government to order a performance and value audit of Nova Scotia Power and their operations. The kind of audit will identify if there are cost savings to be made internally in Nova Scotia Power. These savings could then offset rate increases Nova Scotia Power wants to force on ratepayers. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in my place today and speak to Bill 45, the Ratepayers Act bill, which was introduced by the Liberals. You know, it's a very interesting thing. We're in a situation where the world is dealing with a fossil fuel addiction, and our province is in a very difficult situation because when our government, when the former government was in the position to be able to start doing something 15 years ago, the former government did nothing. And we are in the position we're in today because of lack of initiative and a lack of foresight and a lack of planning. The biggest single reason that electricity rates have gone up as high as they have is because of the cost of cost of oil and the cost of coal. Over the past 6 years, the price of coal has increased 75%. Our renewables account for 1.5% of the rate increases. And so we understand that it's coal that is such a big problem over the last 6 years.
Absolutely.
We've put environmental targets in place, Madam Speaker, that will help us move away from fuel. One of the things that's really important, too, in our approach is to widen our stance, to be able to allow people to conserve energy and not use so much. It's always so interesting. We're trying to find the cheapest rates of electricity and fuel instead of really personally claiming responsibility on some level for our personal use. I recently attended a meeting last Friday night after a long week here in the legislature in Mahone Bay at the Council of Canadians, where they were talking about smart grids. And they're talking about appliances in homes, smart thermostats, which will regulate and work with different appliances to help us use fuel in times when it's not being used at a higher rate. Our government understands that the burden of rising electrical prices is very hard on the pocketbooks of Nova Scotia, which is why when we took office, we removed the HST on energy and legislated some of the most aggressive renewable energy targets in the world.
You want awards for that? Yes, we did.
We won awards for that. Yes, we did. In our targets for 2012, targeting 40% of our electricity to be from renewables. And this truly is something that we can be proud of and our children can be proud of. The other side doesn't seem to be offering a lot of solutions. This particular bill is calling for audits, and as we know, in the fall, the UARB said that if these sorts of audits were happening by NSPI, that they're very, very expensive, and these audits will also go back on the backs of ratepayers. So we don't need all sorts of expensive audits. We need to follow a plan, and plans that will work for us. That's why our government is aggressively moving toward Lower Churchill project and other renewable projects like wind and tidal. Madam Speaker, we know that the Fundy tides are the highest in the world, and the technology that's being developed for Fundy tidal are being looked at by many countries. We're creating some innovative changes, and those things will really work. We have the highest tides in the world, and they will bring us some wonderful energy. Our government also knows that the dependence on imported oil is a really big thing. It's a big problem. We have our renewable energy electricity plan that we released in April 2010. It clearly states that there will be upfront costs associated with developing more renewable sources of energy, and possibly 1 or 2% on electricity bills will rise in the very short term, but we feel that this is a really reasonable price to pay so that we can have more affordable electricity in the future. Our plan is to make life more affordable for Nova Scotians in the long run, and doing nothing would obviously raise the cost of electricity much more.
That's what that was the problem.
Renewable electricity prices do not go away over time, and these carbon-based fuels will. Moving toward local renewable energy sources will help stabilize energy prices for the future and for our children and for their grandchildren. And I know that when my children are in the position to be able to have homes of their own, they'll be talking and using by way of a normal circumstance to create a home that would be energy efficient, to create a home that is well insulated, that has insulated windows and roofs, that has all sorts of innovative processes like geothermal, things that are being worked out now in such a good way that in the past were new, and there were all sorts of problems with these as new kinds of ways of heating your home. In my area, we have some new Canadian citizens who have made for the last number of years an interesting wood-burning stove called a kakalofon. Now, kakalofon is a very interesting kind of stove that creates a wall of mass. And it's so efficient on the inside of its chambers that the smoke that comes out the top is very, very clean. And it takes very small amounts of dry wood to activate the kakalofon. And once it warms up, you have a lovely warm seat that you can sit on and put your back against the warm mass ceramic tile. And these are the kinds of things that our children will be using when they're building homes of the future. They'll think differently than we did. They won't be building inefficient homes that rely on oil, that cost thousands and thousands of dollars every month to fuel. That's not the way it'll happen. They'll be using solar on their roofs. We're looking at different sorts of solar now at a municipal level and a provincial level, and these things certainly will help with business in the province. It'll also, in Dartmouth, we have businesses that work in solar, and that will certainly help with the spin-off. I'm sure there'll be many industries that will be employed creating these sorts of things. Our plan will also support as much as $1.5 billion in green investment and create an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 jobs in the future. We're taking a balanced approach to transforming our electricity system, which will be of the best interest for Nova Scotians. Our plan is based on an intensive process of public and expert input that include consultation with Nova Scotians on how to stabilize the rates through these increasing renewables. Madam Speaker, we have also put in a number of other programs. We've got our energy rebate program, which automatically rebates the equivalence of the provincial portion of the HST on our energy bills. This is something that's a very important program. We also have our home heating assistance rebate program, and that rebate is $200 for eligible applicants who heat their homes with oil, electricity, wood, propane, pellets, natural gas, or coal. And when I was speaking earlier about efficiency and how efficient our homes will be, Efficiency Nova Scotia is a department that's really working very hard to help people analyze the efficiency of their homes, to see how the kinds of upgrades that are required to help low-income homeowners who heat with electricity. These things show a vision, they show a plan, they show a multiple way of approaching our issues with electricity that all of us face. And I think that these are all very, very important things that our government is doing. We are moving away from fossil fuels, and we're reducing the impact of these prices. Madam Speaker, our connection with Newfoundland and Labrador through the Lower Churchill project is one that is a very exciting project for all the Atlantic provinces. It shows teamwork, it shows a collegial and collaborative approach among the provinces. Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia are working now to see all the possibilities of this project. This is a very complex issue dealing with native land claims, making sure that things are in the right place. And when this all comes about, it will give us a 35-year window of energy that will stay at a stable rate. This is something that we can all look forward to. Nova Scotia's dependence on coal and the failure, renewable fuels. So it also states this whole thing with Lower Churchill will help develop new technologies. Every project brings its own issues, and each project with challenges, new solutions are found. And with the Lower Churchill project, we're looking at innovation that will be developed, that will also be looked at from other parts of the world, and take the whole idea of new ways of working with hydropower. I think you're going to be on. So, Madam Speaker, I would just like to say that, again, we're working toward a balanced approach. We're very pleased with the things that our government has been doing. The idea of Bill 45, of having audits that will cost far too much, is just something that we don't want to consider. Looking again at just the current costs of fuels, gasoline and diesel have both increased by 12%, which is almost 15 cents a litre since October 2010. Furnace oil for home heating has increased by 20% and currently over $1 a litre. Electricity has increased 5.5% and natural gas has increased by 14%, though it remains half of the cost of furnace fuel on this per energy basis. Even the costs of wood are going up, and due to higher transportation costs, but it's usually the lowest option for rural Nova Scotia. I know that all the people in my area start to get their wood very early, start chopping it and getting it piled up so the air will move through it and dry it, so they have a good stock of wood long before they need to use it. Nova Scotia has put forward a lot of programs that will be very helpful to us in the future. We're dealing with the cost of energy that's been rising with this multi-pronged plan. And I think that at this point, Madam Speaker, I will take my seat. I'm very, very pleased to have been able to stand here and talk today about this. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Speaker. Okay. Is that it?
I recognize the honourable member for Kings North on an introduction. Is that no?
To continue on the bill, on
Yes.
Bill 45.
No, I'm sorry. No, it would go to the Progressive Conservative Party at this stage. The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think we would all agree on one thing in the legislature here. If we're talking about protecting ratepayers, I think we would all agree that what we're trying to do is protect them from the ever-escalating cost of power and energy. And there's a number of things I'd like to talk about today. We've brought legislation before members of this House. One of the pieces of legislation would compel Nova Scotia Power to indicate what portion of any rate increase is caused by government policies on our power bills. And we've heard the honourable member who just spoke speak about our fossil fuel addiction. And it's interesting, Madam Speaker, I think about many years ago, there was a windmill put up near Shetticamp, but there wasn't any others put up. And I can only assume that at that time, Nova Scotia Power didn't see the value in putting more of them up. So it's, I suppose it's not that long ago. It's, for some people, it's a long time ago. I've heard a couple of members saying they were quite young at the time, 15 years ago. But I guess, Madam Speaker, my point is that I don't think all is what it seems to be when we look at energy. And I'll get to some of these points during my discussion. But we believe that it should be transparent. If government energy policies affecting power rates, let's take away all the philosophical debate, let's take away the political debate, let's cut to the chase and look at the numbers. We believe in that. We need to make sure that to protect ratepayers, people who are paying power bills, we need to make sure that the shareholder rates of return that people who own stock in Emera, that it's fair to the people who are paying the power bills to that company. And by that I mean if they're getting a regulated rate of return over 9%, and they don't have as many risks in their business model as most other companies would, do they really deserve to be getting over 9%? So the other thing we introduced a piece of legislation on was getting bonuses, executive bonuses, out of the rates, and paid for after that rate of 9% plus profit is taken. So those were initiatives, Madam Speaker, to try to protect ratepayers, so we can appreciate when there are bills brought forward that are that the interest is to protect ratepayers from increasing power bills. We look at Muskrat Falls, and there was debate about it today during question period. And you know, it's amazing that government would go and publicly proclaim that what a wonderful thing it is to enter this deal without even knowing what the numbers are behind it. So, and to my point earlier, when we think about the irresponsibility of that, and the fact that it's something, once you're locked into it, you're locking the province in for many, many years. So, you know, why not have the, and perhaps the Premier said today, it sounded like he was going to ask the UARB to take a look at the numbers behind that project. So it's important for government to do its homework, Madam Speaker, but I would encourage them to do it before they start proclaiming deals. There's a number of things I wanted to speak about, and you know, one of the things, I read a report, an Auditor General's report in Ontario, and I think every member should pick up a copy of this report and have a read of it. It talks about the experience in Ontario the last number of years, some of the things they've tried to do to make their province greener. And Madam Speaker, it's been quite disastrous for their province, for their economy. And an Auditor General's report that was released earlier this year goes into detail about some of the errors that were made in Ontario. And I'll give you an example. When we think about green energy, we think it's free. We picture windmills spinning around, giving us free energy. What many people don't realize is there's a cost to those structures, to construct them. And they are more expensive. To construct them and to maintain them and to replace them. And in Ontario, over a 5-year period, 23% of the rate of increase in power bills was as a result of the move towards renewable energy, and moving towards it too quickly, more quickly than was economically feasible. And when I say that, Madam Speaker, I think about all the people that have to pay their power bills. Imagine, you know, if your power bill for the past year is $3,000, imagine having to pay an extra $750. That would be a 25% increase. Madam Speaker, that is not making life more affordable for citizens, and I think it's important that government accepts the responsibility to think about that. And the other thing that was discovered in Ontario is that people don't really know that these initiatives cost more, and why would they? Because we often hear the Premier extolling it. We heard the member opposite just speaking, saying that, you know, we have this addiction to fossil fuels, we got to get off it. Well, if we came off it completely tomorrow, what would that do to power rates? I honestly don't believe, Madam Speaker, that the members opposite understand. I really don't think they do. They think that green energy is free, when in fact a premium is paid for green energy. Well, now they say, Madam Speaker, that they do know. I think if they realized how much more, and maybe the members would like to get up and talk about if maybe a 25% increase over the next few years is something that their constituents would appreciate. That's what happened in Ontario. That's what happened in Ontario, Madam Speaker, and perhaps the members opposite would like to go back to their constituencies and tell their constituents that they've got this great new energy policy upon which Muskrat Falls is a part of. It's a wonderful thing. Oh, by the way, it's going to cost you an extra $750 next year to pay your power bills. I think there'd be a lot of moans and groans and rubbing of eyes and dissatisfaction, much as the members hate to hear me say this right now. But that's the reality of it. And that's been the Ontario experience. So people don't mind, Madam Speaker, I don't think people mind paying a small premium for green energy, but they cannot afford to be paying the premiums that are required based on the energy policy put forth by this government. And I would compare it to a tank of gasoline. Most people can't afford to buy a $200 tank of gas. But that's, if you start increasing, if we look at some of these renewable energy sources, you start looking at how much more they cost compared to the energy, what it's been the last number of years, you're looking at 2 and 3 times the cost of energy. That's the premium. So, Madam Speaker, the other thing is, the other thing I would like to speak about is and just, I guess, to highlight the point even more, in Ontario and their experience, and it's no different here, Madam Speaker, you know, the question, I guess, would have to be asked, is it true that wind and solar renewable power will add significant cost to our power bills? And in their case, it was 2 to 10 times higher to conventional sources such as nuclear power, which they have in Ontario, coal and natural gas. So, Madam Speaker, the other thing that I think we need to be cognizant of is the impact on the economy. And I know with the paper mill, which this government is working on to try to save in Point Tupper, and I know they've come forth recently, well, at least the two parties have come forth with an agreement that I understand some legislation will need to be passed here in this House to support it happening. But when a company uses 13 to 15% of the electricity in the province, and there's great fluctuations in power rates, it affects the people that are working there. And you know, people often tout the benefit of the jobs created in renewable energy, and sure, there's jobs created, but there have been studies that show, and it was reported in the Auditor General's report in Ontario, that for every one of those jobs created, it kills 2 to 4 jobs elsewhere in the economy. And so the experience in other jurisdictions suggests that that those jobs that are created well, just what I said there. I'm not going to repeat it again, but there was a study that also found that each job that created under renewable energy policy cost between $90,000 and $140,000 per year in public subsidies, or about 175 to 250% of the average wage paid to manufacturing workers. So these are points that, Madam Speaker, that we think the government should be hearing, should be considering, and not to just be blindly moving off with policies that might sound good as far as the philosophy is concerned, but when you look at the facts and you look at the numbers, they're only hurting Nova Scotians. Madam Speaker, and I don't have a problem with us going into dabbling in renewable energy, because we know that investment in the industry will help develop those technologies further. And so however, I guess one of the things that concerns me about getting more into things like wind energy is that sometimes they're not even reducing our need for fossil fuels. And the member opposite talked about how we have to get off this addiction for using fossil fuels. And sadly, oftentimes when fossil fuels are replaced by things like wind, there's a cost to make up for the inefficiency of the wind. In Ontario, it was recognized that the lack of correlation between electricity demand and intermittent renewable energy created operational challenges, including power surpluses and the need for backup power generated by other sources. And Madam Speaker, what I mean by that is when the wind isn't blowing, which is often at times when it's most needed, if it's not there, the backup supply of fossil fuel has to be increased. It's inefficient, and it causes more burning of fossil fuels. So this is something that, Madam Speaker, that I think most people don't realize. So in their efforts to replace fossil fuel, they may not even be achieving that. Yet they're increasing power bills for consumers, and you know, that's a loss times two, Madam Speaker, because it's not working. The I've got too many papers here, Madam Speaker. This is not one of my better speeches. I've got too much information here, and it's good information, but it's all over the place.
1 minute now.
So
we have 1 minute left. We've had to adjust the timing a bit.
So, Madam Speaker, I guess if I, you know, to try to sum it up, I think we're debating here ultimately politics and philosophy versus common sense and facts. And if the members opposite feel as strongly as they do about the policies that their government is bringing forward, let's turn that philosophy into facts. Turn it into the numbers. Show us the numbers. And show yourselves the numbers. And if you can prove it, then you'll feel better about what you're extolling here in this legislature. You'll feel better about what you're telling Nova Scotians. And if you don't do it, Madam Speaker, if the members don't do it, then I would suggest to them that they don't have a very good basis in what they're putting forth. So, Madam Speaker, with that, I will conclude my remarks.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that in 3 years, that might be the first time I've heard someone channel the former Minister of Energy, Bill Dukes, and wonder what happens when the wind doesn't blow. Here's the thing, you know, Madam Speaker, there are things that, there are some things that we agree on, I guess, in the House, and there's others we don't. We know, and I mean, it was reiterated this morning, that the fossil fuel prices are on a consistent rise. The federal Conservative government has mandated the phase out of coal plants. You know, and while that has been delayed somewhat under the agreement reached with them, the federal Conservative Party has mandated that. So that's coming to an end anyway. So, you know, it's not, there are, the third party can stand and say that, you know, part of our future or a significant part of our future can rest on coal, but of course it can't. And it can't for, there's not just environmental reasons. You know, even if you don't believe in climate change and you think the earth is flat, the fact of the matter is that the federal Conservative government, which is perhaps the single most right-wing party in the country, has mandated the closure of coal plants. So, you know, that's just a fact. So the only other option is to move to non-coal sources, and renewables do provide, and the chair of the board said that this morning, that the renewables will provide long-term, stable, will provide long-term, stable prices on renewable energy. So the fact is we have to deal with the realities of federal regulation and where pricing is going. We know, for example, that the Pubnico wind farm is now producing energy at lower than the price of coal. That's probably the only one that is at the moment in Nova Scotia because of the way the capital costs have been addressed. But ultimately, you know, you'll find that we know that, for example, natural gas, which we can have a whole debate in here on whether that's renewable, but natural gas obviously is part of the energy mix that's permitted going in the future, is very low at the moment, and probably with some of the shale plays around North America will stay very low. So the question becomes, so we know that that's the reality that we're in. We know that the reality we're in is a future where, whether it comes from renewables, and frankly, it only makes sense to use the cost-effective renewables, and there's been a push for some renewables that frankly aren't necessarily as cost-effective as others, but in the reality of the fact that you're either going to be dealing with higher fossil fuel prices, or you're going to be dealing with energy rates that are stable but higher from renewable energy, then you have to look at other options. And we've advocated for a number of those options. For example, importing hydropower from Hydro-Quebec, which is currently selling on the market, I understand, at around 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is below coal, it's below natural gas, it's below wind, it's below basically every other source on the market. There's a limited amount of power that we can bring in from that, but even when the government talks about Muskrat Falls, they're only talking about 8% of the province's energy. So you still need to have it from other sources, and it's a maximum of 8%, I might add. And so when you look at mitigating that with lower prices and lower options by importing, that makes sense. So this bill, the Ratepayer Protection Act, starts to address some of the issues that impact rates no matter what the fuel source is. You know, and it was interesting to hear the member for the NDP caucus stand and talk about how they do not like they don't like the idea of having the audits, but neglected to talk about the issue of bonuses, something the minister wouldn't even answer the other day. The minister would not stand up in this House and say that he opposed ratepayers being responsible for bonuses. And this morning, I put that question directly to the chair of the Utility and Review Board, and he said, listen, and we all know this, as part of the backroom deal that was created for the last rate hike, the bonuses were taken out for a year. But that was on the that was part of that negotiation. Mr. Bennett, the CEO of Nova Scotia Power, was very blunt and honest to say that that isn't something you should necessarily expect for future years. The chair of the Utility and Review Board was quite clear this morning that currently the Public Utilities Act, which outlines what can and cannot be considered, or what may and may not be considered in a rate, does not exclude the inclusion of executive bonuses. That is one example of something that this government could do which would measurably reduce future rate increases. There's a reason why it was taken out in the last rate hike, and it was taken out because it was a cost to ratepayers. Those bonuses, those executive bonuses, can be taken out of the rate base permanently. But the government's unwilling to do that. And that is not a debate about who should pay for conservation. That is not a debate about renewables versus fossil fuels. That is just the fact that that's a simple choice. It's an amendment to the Public Utilities Act that would prevent that from being happen. Another element that this bill would do is to require Nova Scotia Power to publicly publish its estimated and actual costs on a regular basis. We all have that feeling, at least I think we all have that feeling, that Nova Scotia Power walks into a Utility and Review Board hearing and asks for the moon, the sun, and the sky, knowing they're going to get a little bit less. It's like the car salesman asking you to pay $35,000 for the vehicle when he knows he'll sell it to you for $27,000. And that's exactly the game that Nova Scotia Power is playing, because they want to shock you with a high rate and make you feel relieved that they only took some of the money from your wallet. And that's not right. And so there are a number of steps in here, a number of proposals that would prevent that, that would open that process to more transparency and more honesty. And frankly, the chair of the Utility and Review Board sat here this morning, and when I asked him whether he felt that Nova Scotia Power had become significantly more transparent, he said he would agree they were transparent, but he wouldn't use the word significantly. And they're still working on that. This is one of the steps to legislatively force them to do that. Publishing the estimated and actual costs are important. At the moment, you can get them, but you have to sign up as an intervener and sign a confidentiality agreement. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why should all of those costs be secret? Why shouldn't people know what they actually spent and how close to their estimates they were? We know that, for example, the Utility and Review Board has chastised Nova Scotia Power for its errors in coal forecasting, and the member for Halifax-Chebucto raised that issue this morning. We know that they have been chastised for their secrecy over issues, and in fact, there were issues that had to be pulled out. This would legislatively require Nova Scotia Power to publish both its estimates and its actuals, and it would help limit the amount of that shooting high and coming in a little bit lower at the end of the day, because the public would know, and anybody that wanted to go in would know. And frankly, not everybody's going to, but there are people who, if they had access to that information, would be able to make more complete representations. The board has also talked about new processes and settlement hearings, and this would legislate something the board has recommended and again talked about this morning. Settlement hearings are starting to happen, but the board chair this morning said that they don't happen early enough, and he wants them to happen earlier. But this would put an added incentive into it to say that unless you can address these through a public settlement hearing before the rate hike hearing and address the major issues, then the costs of the hearing are borne by shareholders. And that means, again, it's about putting the burden on shareholders instead of the burden on ratepayers. And I'm sorry, but at a 9.2 to 9.5% guaranteed rate of return, the shareholders can stand to take a little bit of risk. And that's what's, I can't think of any company in this country that gets that kind of return that doesn't have to be exposed to a little bit of risk. And so there becomes a choice. They either have to, and this government has to do it legislatively through the Electricity Act and the Public Utilities Act. You either force them to take on risk or you drastically reduce that rate of return, because you can't have both. Over the past 3 years, since 2009, electricity rates have climbed by over 20% for residential customers. And we all pay, we all have electric bills. Some of us have more than one. So we've all seen those increases, and I'm sure many people like me have gone around and done things to reduce our energy consumption and still seen that bill increase. And many people have seen that. And they see that in part because of the dramatic nature of, like, over 20% in the past 3 years, over 40% in the past 10 years in electricity prices. There are options that measurably change the things that can be included in a rate. And there are options that the government can take to make those happen. And they can't happen without legislation. Many of these things are not things that the board has the ability to do without changes in legislation. And that's part of what we all need to remember, is the board is effectively a creature of the Public Utilities Act and has to follow what's in that act. They don't get to make up their own rules. They follow the rules set out by the provincial government. And so at a time that these rates are climbing like this is the opportunity to ensure that this utility is properly regulated, that we have options to allow our energy sector to work, to be properly regulated, and also to ensure that things that ratepayers shouldn't be responsible for aren't on that rate base. There are some limited steps that the Utility and Review Board have taken in this regard, but they are very limited because they're limited by what is actually in that legislation. And that's a shame. So we have the chance in this session and through this act, or if the only criticism that I've heard from government on this act is about the audits. So fine. I think the audits are important, but take the audits out and pass the rest. I haven't heard a single criticism from the government on any of the other elements of this bill. And frankly, the cost of the audits is a red herring, since the bill makes them the responsibility of Nova Scotia Power and actually removes other costs and is cost neutral. So, but if they don't like that, if they're concerned about that, they don't think that Nova Scotia Power, which takes money out of Nova Scotians' pockets every week or every month, shouldn't be audited in this manner, in a public value for money audit, then fine, take that out and pass the rest of it, because frankly, I've not heard, in the couple of times this has been debated, I've never heard any criticism of the other elements that are in this bill from government. Is the minister and the government saying that they think ratepayers should pay for bonuses? Are they saying that costs shouldn't be publicly available? Are they saying that ratepayers should be forced to pay for settlement hearings that result from Nova Scotia Power shooting high and coming in low? Because that's the real question in this. There's only one tiny element of this that I've heard a criticism of from government in the 3 times that this has been debated. And we haven't heard the government's position on the other 3 elements, and I think it's time that they give us that answer. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Kings North with 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I'm pleased just to have those couple of minutes to stand and speak to Bill 45. And you know, it occurred to me as I was listening to the debate this afternoon that we're approaching an anniversary. 20 years ago this fall, the Donnie Cameron government sold Nova Scotia Power Corporation. You know, that was a dark day, and I think you know, it will be a dark anniversary when we celebrate that later this year. But I think it might be interesting to speculate what might have been if that was the government of the Progressive Conservative Party. But it might be interesting, Madam Speaker, to speculate what might have been if that decision had not been taken those 20 years ago. If the government of the day, and maybe the Liberal Party of the day, had had the foresight to think about how can governments actually make a difference in the lives of people. But instead, that government, as the Conservative Party so often does, and as the Liberal Party seems to still do, take that peculiar position that good government is government that steps back from the interests of the people. And I think that decision 20 years ago was exactly the consequence of that kind of thinking. But I do think it would be interesting to speculate what might have happened if that hadn't occurred 20 years ago, and if instead the government of the day had begun to imagine, had begun to recognize the effects of global warming, had begun to recognize that we needed to import coal to fire our electricity, had begun to think about what could be different in the future, and had started the work that we started a couple of years ago, 20 years ago, we would be in a very, very different place, having a very different discussion, and not simply talking about adding another layer of bureaucracy and another cost to the ratepayers of this province.
Recognize the Deputy House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have an eager member over here. We call a private members public bills for second reading.
Private members and public okay, I don't have the wording. Private members and public bills for second reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would call Bill 46, the Electricity Act amended.
Thank you. I'll now call Bill 46, the Electricity Act, and recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and that's a double faux pas, because Kings North was called Kings West, now Kings West being called Kings North. So there we go. But anyway, those things happened here in the House, and in referencing the member for Kings North, you know, we sometimes don't know all of the history, and in fact forget what the stand and position of our parties at different points in time, and I think that's a very probably normal and natural thing. And 20 years ago, the NDP also very much thought and advocated that cheap coal out of Cape Breton, that coal was king. Yeah, coal was king 20 years ago in the world view of the NDP at that time. So we all know that times change. So today, however, times have really changed too much for Nova Scotians when it comes to power rates, and I would say my constituency office has gone through a winter period that saw the most notices of disconnection. Now, you know, Nova Scotia Power are cognizant enough, of course, not to inflict the deepest of pains, and that is to disconnect and cut off the power in the winter, but nevertheless they'll send out the disconnection notices. And I think it really is just another indicator that you know, we have simply gone too far in this province. And I just did receive information from the library. It's a known fact, so probably if it needs to be tabled, I can certainly table it. But Nova Scotia now pay the second highest rates in Canada. We are just below Yellowknife in terms of the rates that we pay. And every Nova Scotian household, every one of our businesses and our biggest industries have that as top of mind. And we know that without the very complex deal that Stern Paper and Nova Scotia Power have forged over the last number of months, you know, the future of the mill in Port Hawkesbury, the Callander Mill, was very, very much in doubt as to starting up. Just like over the next few years, because of power rates, we'll see the demise, unfortunately, of another of our mills in this province. So one of the things that associated with this bill, Bill number 46, the Electricity Act, this bill permits renewable energy providers to sell directly to customers. And, you know, I think this is, again, part of the energy fix in this province whose time truly has come. And the one major distinguishing factor that we need to realize and correct a concerned government is that this has nothing to do with deregulation. Well, let's be very, very clear about what Bill number 46 is actually proposing. It is a bill. It's been introduced by our caucus at least twice, maybe 3 times. And this bill will help to create more competition in the energy sector by allowing producers of renewable energy to sell directly to Nova Scotia consumers. Now, one of the areas that I would have liked to have seen is that if we're going to develop biomass, and I think there is a place in conjunction with our forestry industry to have small-scale biomass plants in this province. I think truly they could be viable and fit into a sustainable forestry regime for this province. I am a little worried, in fact, I'm quite worried about the concentration of 60 megawatts in one part of the province, because it will not be viable to truck wood across this province to keep that large-scale operation, you know, going. So the wood supply has to come from neighboring counties, neighboring areas of Port Hawkesbury. But I would very much have liked to have seen small-scale biomass run by, you know, private entities and sell directly, whether it's a regional hospital, whether it's a Michelin plant, or even for you know, a community enterprise that I think would in fact start down the road of competition that would in fact start to reel in Nova Scotia Power and what seems to be very automatic. Whenever the rate request goes before the UARB, we can be sure that it's pretty well automatic, except for maybe 1 or 2% below the request. You know, increased competition will mean Nova Scotia Power rates will become more competitive. So I think this is a bill whose time has come, and I would, you know, I think the production of power in our province again is one of those, you know, nonpartisan ideas, and I think we have to embrace what is best for Nova Scotians and what is best for our future in terms of generating power, making us once again competitive, not second place behind Yellowknife, And we know that companies that are intensive use of power do want to see small-scale production and with a feed directly into their operations. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and my pleasure to have a few minutes this evening to speak about Bill 46. You know, I think one of the things that's been missing from the debate, as I've listened to it lo these many days in the House, is context. And because life is contextual, I think it's important to put things in context. You know, the great poet John Donne said, "No man is an island, and no province is an island, and no country is an island." And we live in a world that is interconnected. And one of our own great Canadians, Marshall McLuhan, said the world's a global village, and he was right about that too. So I think when we talk about things like, and we're talking about electricity tonight, we have to look at what's happened in the world over the last 50 years or so. And what's happened in the world over the last 50 years or so is Chinese folks have largely, in many sectors, stopped riding bicycles and started driving cars. And they have become industrialized and are now one of the leading economies in the world, driven by electricity. The subcontinent, India, the second largest country in the world, now has a burgeoning middle class. One time North America got to hog all the energy. We don't get to hog all the energy anymore, nor should we. And as a result, anybody who understands capitalistic principles and supply and demand knows that when there's great demand and short supply, the price goes up. And that's exactly what's happened in this particular case. And so I just thought it would be maybe a good idea to set the stage that way as we punt the ball back and forth constantly in here talking about electricity and electrical rates. And I'm not sure any Nova Scotian really cares much about that. What they care about is, can we solve a problem that we have, that being the cost of electricity here in Nova Scotia. And I think they want us to do something about it. I mean, I'm standing here, there's a plaque behind me that talks about responsible government. Mr. Howe's on the wall over here holding his muniments, talking about many years in our history talking about responsible government. And you know, Mr. Howe would expect us to treat this issue responsibly. And to treat this issue responsibly, I think he would expect us to not use stream of consciousness or some other method where you make up the story as you go, but I think what he would want us to do, and I indeed think what we need to do, and actually what is totally necessary to do, is have something called a plan. And that plan has to be sensible, it has to be affordable, and it has to be implemented, and it has to be implemented soon, because we don't want to be fiddling while Rome burns here. So I think other members have said, several other members have said, so I don't have to say it again very much, that, that one of the big problems we've had is the cost of coal, because that is what we use largely in Nova Scotia to generate electricity. And everybody, I don't think anybody disagrees on this, but most people say it's gone up about 75% or so. So we know for a fact that that's not something that we can continue to rely on if we want to have reasonable power rates here. And so a plan, some kind of a plan that demonstrates that we're going to try to change that would obviously be a good plan. And so we got to reduce that burden for everybody in Nova Scotia, including not just the citizenry, the folks who we see every day in our constituencies, but also for the companies that hire our constituents and who have them working. And that's why on the first part, for the individual citizens, we took the HST on energy, we took the HST off energy costs so that life would be a little bit more affordable for those folks. But we know, just by listening to the news in the last couple of months and the stories around New Page and around Bowater, and our other large users of electricity in the province, that we have some serious work to do there as well. You know, the Premier has said in the past, now is not the time. I think this is what he said anyway, and I would stand corrected if he didn't. I think he said now is not the time for an increase in the allowable return on equity. So seeing Nova Scotia Power agreeing that the ROE go down in the agreement earlier this year is good news. And you know what? That's the truth. That was good news. And the customers have decided they want to be able to scrutinize any proposed rate increases on an annual basis rather than look at a multi-year rate. And I have to say, and I think my colleagues agree, I respect that decision, and I think they do as well. So that's why our government is aggressively looking for alternate sources of energy, and that includes the Churchill Falls project, it includes wind power, and it includes tidal power. And that dependence that I talked about a while ago on imported coal and the failure of previous governments, and I don't want to get on a big story about it, but the failure of previous governments to implement a plan, which is what I indicated a few minutes ago, to bring stability to electricity prices and have that reflected in our electricity bills, that was largely a failure of all governments to the present time. And I know in question period today, we heard a lot of talk, an awful lot of talk, about growing the economy and how come the economy's not growing and why didn't the economy grow faster? Well, newsflash on this, there's a worldwide recession. Greece almost went broke. And there are some other issues around the European economic community which have caused a few problems. And then there was, and I hesitate to bring this up, the collapse of the financial institutions in the United States, which may have had a minor effect on the way things are rolling out here in Nova Scotia. So, you know, although we're good, we're really good, we can't fix everything almost immediately. We can just fix it over a couple of mandates. We'll have it straightened out and we'll be able to move on. So that's what needs to happen. So our plan is actually, as we go forward, making life more affordable for Nova Scotians. And the reason is we're investing money now, Madam Speaker. We are investing money now so we will save money in the future. That's called being smart. When we talk about Efficiency Nova Scotia, you know, we invest money. Not only do we invest money in retrofitting homes and retrofitting homes for even low-income families, bringing down the amount of electricity we use, but while we're doing that, we employ people who do the retrofits, which actually grows the economy. Madam Speaker, that's called a double whammy. It's a really good thing to do. It's what governments should be doing, and it's part of making life better for all Nova Scotians. And we're going to stick with that plan, we're going to implement that plan, and we're going to make Nova Scotia a better place to live, work, and play every day. Madam Speaker, thank you very much.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'll have to thank the member from Lunenburg West for that animated and fiery speech, but we're talking about making life better for Nova Scotians. I think if you asked each and every Nova Scotian that they're increasing their HST and all the services they've been cut, it's not making life better for Nova Scotians, Madam Speaker. But anyway, besides that, I'm pleased to rise today to talk about Bill 46, an amendment to the Electricity Act to enable opening renewable energy producers to sell electricity directly to the consumer. Madam Speaker, we as a PC caucus are in favour of renewable energy and the benefits it has to the environment and the individuals. But, Madam Speaker, at what cost? We need renewables that will grow with the ability of the consumer to pay and grow with the economy, not phased in all at once to the fact that the people can't pay. And we're hearing blanket statements about this. We reduce costs for ratepayers. But, Madam Speaker, I haven't seen any real proof of that yet. Our power rates have gone up and up and up over the last 3 years, and the renewable rates continue to be higher than any other rates. While we encourage the province to expand this renewable capacity
there has to be a market of people willing to pay the premium price for that. Madam Speaker, we're hearing about them investing now. Well, if we're investing in renewables, what happens when the wind dies? When there's no wind, when the NDP governments aren't in power and there's no wind, what do we have? We have to have some kind of backup plan.
Order, please. Chatter in the room is making it difficult for me to hear. I recognize the honourable member. Order. The honourable member for Cape Breton North has the floor.
Madam Speaker, development costs of renewable energy are high. We don't know what the upkeep costs are going to be. Madam Speaker, I remember back a number of years ago when they came out with hybrid cars. The cost of those cars were, and they're talking about electric cars, and the cost of those cars are out of reach of the average Nova Scotian. But the average Nova Scotian has to have power. And to have these renewables forced on us in a manner that we can't pay, Madam Speaker, is just not right. If we go with all renewables and we have no wind, how do we store that power? We have to have a battery backup, Madam Speaker, and that's expensive. And to replace that batteries is expensive. And if we're opening up renewables directly from the producer to the consumer, how do they transmit that energy? That energy has to be transmitted on power lines. Those lines are owned now by Mirror or Nova Scotia Power. They're going to charge for that. And we've already heard we have the second highest cost in Canada. And Madam Speaker, I heard them talk about getting off of coal. And we know that we're going to rely on coal over the next 30 years. And we know that coal is cheaper now than the renewables are. And Madam Speaker, we have an area in Cape Breton, the Donkin area, that can produce coal at a rate that we could use in this province. And we also have a sustainability and energy center at the Cape Breton University that's trying to study clean technologies, clean coal technologies, using the geothermal from the mines. So all that stuff, Madam Speaker, can go a long way in how we produce our costs. Now, we see from the COMFIT program that the rates are higher. Not only will producers have to build the capacity, they'll also have to transmit this electricity, like I said. They will have to either build their own transmission lines, which is extremely expensive, or use the already existing lines and rent them from what's there. And that's cost to the producer, to the consumer, we don't know of. It's the responsibility of the government to make sure the power rates in this province are affordable and not driving people and businesses away. We need to get the basics right, such as competitive tax structure, reducing red tape, and keeping power rates affordable. We currently have some of the highest taxes in the country and highest power rates in the country, which doesn't improve our competitive advantage. Now, we see from this government's mismanagement of the Muskrat Falls project, they're not willing to do their homework and study the true costs of what it's going to cost the consumers in Nova Scotia to get this power. We're hearing something like 17 cents a kilowatt hour for Newfoundlanders. And if we have to build a transmission line to come across the Atlantic and sell it through here, that's going to cost more to the people in Nova Scotia. Yes, it may stabilize power rates, but at what cost? The government's committing to ratepayers to foot the bill without telling each and every one of us what it will cost. We've heard some reports from Newfoundland that they're doing their homework on the Muskrat Falls. And Nova Scotia deserves the government will do the same. Do their homework. Create policies that are in the best interest of Nova Scotians, that are affordable and reliable. Reliable and stable is good, Madam Speaker, but we have to know the cost. The Utility Review Board Chair came before Public Accounts Committee today and said that in-province hydro remains the cheapest option, next to the low cost of coal. However, we do not have the capacity in Nova Scotia to supply our energy costs with hydro. Without looking into other jurisdictions, we're not going to be able to do that. We need to compare Muskrat Falls to other sources, Hydro-Quebec, natural gas from Maine, or energy from New Brunswick. Ways that we can produce energy to the consumers of Nova Scotia that we know the cost of. And Madam Speaker, just because we can bring hydro ashore in Nova Scotia doesn't mean there's a market for it elsewhere. There's a bottleneck in Maine, and there's already too much electricity on their grid, so the ability to sell that to them will be restricted. This is all questions we have to ask this government, Madam Speaker, but they refuse to do this homework. While diversifying our energy portfolio is important, we need a government that is open and transparent about the costs. If buying energy direct is good, then we should study that. But there are lots of unanswered questions. And when those questions are answered, we'll be able to make informed decisions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And if you have no objection, I'll actually speak about the bill.
Thank you.
You know, there's I've just sat through two members of the third party channeling Bill Dukes and saying the wind might not blow. I figured the first one was a mistake, and then I heard it twice. Then I heard an NDP member suggest that the NDP would never have championed coal 20 years ago, which I think would surprise the member for Cape Breton Centre, who was one of the great champions of coal at that time. So, you know, you know, Madam Speaker, you know, Madam Speaker, this bill would allow renewable energy suppliers to sell directly to customers. And I want to be very clear, because it's quite apparent that the government members haven't actually read the bill in any of the times it's been introduced. And I say that because, you know, we heard the Premier suggest that it was deregulation. In fact, there's not once in this bill does it suggest the URB would not set rates. Not once in this bill does it remove any of the regulatory powers of the URB. In fact, if anything, it refines them and extends them to this new group of suppliers. So, my suggestion, of course, to the NDP researchers would be to actually read the bill before you suggest that it is about deregulation, because, of course, it's not remotely about it in the page that's there. This is actually something that the member for Halifax-Chebucto and the member for Cape Breton Centre have spoken in favour of. And the Premier stood up and said and stated very clearly that he said, well, we've done this. He said, we've done this. We've done this with the feed-in tariffs and so forth. But the problem with that is the recommendation was two parts for a reason. And I think it's important to understand these two parts. Yes, we always knew renewable energy, especially in the short term, was going to have a higher rate than the fossil fuels, because it was going to be, we were going to reach that rate. That's fine. But the other part was that independent renewable energy suppliers, such as Seaforth Energy, who have spoken in favor of this, Chebucto Windfields, and many of these others, who have all spoken in favor of this measure, I might add, pointed out this would allow them access to capital and allow them to expand green jobs in this province, allow them to expand and reduce the price of renewable energy. Now, 2 years ago when we introduced this, one of the government members stood up and tried to suggest that this would result in the collapse of the energy market in Nova Scotia. Well, of course, that hasn't happened in New Brunswick or in any of the other Canadian provinces or U.S. states where this is already the law. I mean, that's just a ridiculous assertion to suggest that that would happen, because it wouldn't. In fact, there was one of the other members over there suggested that we should be thinking ahead. And of course we should. And that's exactly what this does, is allows that to happen. And here are some of the examples. You know, the other day, I think it might have been yesterday, the Premier, I believe, announced that they were exploring moving an airport near Waterville for the possible future expansion of Michelin. So great. But there's a company that has talked about the limitation that what happens is it does not allow them to actually produce energy on their own property because their property isn't big enough. And what they would like the opportunity to do, and many other businesses, is to be able to purchase a property somewhere else or partner with a renewable energy supplier and generate power somewhere and supply the mill, for example. Well, you're not allowed to do that at the moment, and it actually takes this legislation to do that, to allow those companies to say, you know what, we're going to self-generate, or at least self-generate a certain amount of our energy. So there are farmers that, of course, do this, and there are companies that do some of this. There are a few Atlantic superstore sites that do this, but they do it because they have the ability on their own property to do this. And that is the only way in Nova Scotia you are currently legally allowed to do that. So, Madam Speaker, that's why this bill is important. This is a bill that promotes green jobs, it promotes opportunities in manufacturing and the green economy, and it is also something which allows competition in a regulated marketplace, just like the same legislation allows that in New Brunswick. And this is why I would assume that the member for Cape Breton Centre and the member for Halifax-Shabukta have previously spoken in favour of this. Nothing has changed in that time that would suddenly make this deregulation, and it's a ridiculous assertion to say that, to try and suggest that, because nobody has ever said that. We've said it opens up the marketplace, which were, interestingly enough, the exact words that were used by members who are now sitting in the government benches at the time. So, Madam Speaker, this is important. This is an opportunity for Nova Scotians. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the Deputy House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and that concludes our business for the day, and I'm happy to turn it over to the Government House Leader.
Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you. Excuse me, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to thank everybody for their debate today. It was very interesting, very lively. We ask you now, Madam Speaker, the House to now rise to meet from the hours of noon to 10 p.m. tomorrow. After the orders of the day and question period, we will call private and local bills, Bill number 57, government bills for second reading, Bills 71 and 73. And if we're fortunate enough and get permission, if we report any bills back for Committee of the Whole House on bills, maybe we can get unanimous consent. We'll move forward with those. But with that said, Madam Speaker, we ask the House to now rise.
The motion is that the House does now rise to meet again tomorrow, May the 3rd, between the hours of noon and 10 p.m. Is the House ready for the question? All in favour say aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. We've now reached the time of late debate, and I would now read the debate under Rule 5.5 as submitted by the Honourable Member for Truro Bible Hill. Late debate reads, therefore, be it resolved that the irresponsible Liberal proposal to deregulate electricity markets would be a disastrous experiment at the expense of Nova Scotians. I now recognize the Honourable Member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, my colleagues. Thank you. Madam Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to rise this evening to speak to the irresponsible proposal brought forward from the Liberal caucus. Madam Speaker, quite simply, the Liberal caucus suggestion would ensure large companies earn greater profits, while Nova Scotia ratepayers would pay even more for electricity. I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition would like to deregulate the industry and leave Nova Scotia ratepayers at the mercy of an extremely volatile market. Madam Speaker, apparently the Leader of the Official Opposition would like to follow in the steps of Alberta and Ontario and experiment with electricity deregulation on the backs of Nova Scotians and on the backs of our children. But, Madam Speaker, I would like to table a report by the RBC Dominion Securities from 2001